riqueza a través de la participación cultural en las comunidades más afectadas de Gales. Entre 2013 y 2015, David fue el presidente de la Asociación de Museos de Gran Bretaña y actualmente es miembro del Consejo de UK Creative and Cultural Skills y también miembro del comité consejero del British Council Gales. Rob Stein, desde abril de 2016, es vicepresidente ejecutivo y director de programas de la Alianza Americana de Museos, siendo responsable de crear estrategias para el posicionamiento de la Alianza como proveedor de contenido y catalizador global de prácticas de excelencia en museos. Robert es un reconocido autor, orador y consultor en temas de impacto de los museos en sus comunidades, desarrollo de proyectos innovadores en base a la tecnología y cómo las métricas pueden fomentar mejores prácticas en los museos. Marcelo Araujo actualmente es el presidente del Instituto Brasileño de Museos, IBRAM. Fue secretario de Cultura del Estado de Sao Paulo desde 2012 a 2016. Antes dirigió la Pinacoteca del Estado de Sao Paulo de 2002 al 2012 y el Museo Las Artes Gal en Sao Paulo 1997-2001. Creo que tenemos aquí tres representantes hacedores de política cultural en tres ámbitos bien diferenciados como lo son Gran Bretaña, Estados Unidos de América y Brasil, que es uno de los países dentro de América Latina que tomó la delantera en la creación de una política de museos para la compleja red que ellos tienen en todo ese territorio inmenso. Y vamos a aprovechar de esa presencia en este modelo de conversación para enfocarnos en este tiempo de hibridación cultural y las conexiones globales en la cual todos estamos participando. También se producen algunas disoluciones culturales, donde se advierte que algunos patrimonios inmateriales, algunas cuestiones particulares o comportamientos locales que son muy valiosos, pero muchas veces pasan inadvertidos a raíz de una discriminación social o a raíz de la falta de poder económico de quienes son poseedores de esa cultura fenomenal y no son tomados en cuenta en los grandes conglomerados. Vamos a reflexionar sobre las posiciones de los museos y cómo las actuales condiciones del mundo impactan en los museos y cómo las tomas de decisiones de los museos muchas veces son riesgosas, son para bien, son para mal, y por eso la primera pregunta que le hago al panel será, y quiero ponerla en la pantalla para que todos ustedes puedan verla. ¿Do you hear? A lo largo de 3 décadas, de los 70 a los 90, muchos países de América Latina atravesaron periodos de dictaduras y también de políticas neoliberales. Los museos se cuentan entre las víctimas de la época. En contraste, algunos autores del hemisferio norte denominan a ese periodo como las gloriosas décadas para los museos. Aparte de visibilizar la desconexión entre hemisferios, la pregunta será, ¿podrían ofrecer ejemplos de algún verdadero impacto social que hayan promovido a los museos durante ese periodo, a pesar o a raíz de esas condiciones políticas? ¿Quieres empezar, Marcelo?
Bueno, buenos días. Es un gran placer estar acá. Quiero agradecer a Fundación TIPA, American Alliance of Museums y al Parque Explora por la invitación. Voy a complicar un poco lo que Dije Américo porque vou tentar de hablar em este que nós chamamos el portuñol, que é uma mescla de português com espanhol. Pido desculpa aos tradutores. Espero que todos me possam compreender. Bueno, para que podamos ter uma discussão produtiva a respeito do museu como um ator sociopolítico em el contexto latino-americano, creio ser necessário profundizar o entendimento das especificidades deste fenômeno, tentando escapar generalizações que não colaboram para sua compreensão. Deste modo, em uma análise da história dos museus em América, e mais especificamente na América Latina, durante as décadas de 1970 a 1990, creio ser adequado registrar que se alcançaram inúmeros avanços e logros. Apesar das imensas restrições e violências políticas deste período, de los assassinatos de pessoas, de projetos, de sueños, foram anos de muita luta, de grandes resistências e de conquistas. Recordaria, em primeiro lugar, a consolidação do pensamento museológico, fenômeno mundial, pero que teve especial relevância em nosso continente, e cujos cenários visíveis foram a realização de 3 encontros, cujas conclusões são, hasta hoje, reconhecidas como marcos desse processo. A Declaração de la Mesa Redonda de Santiago de Chile, de 1972, que introduziu o conceito de museu integral, abrindo novos caminhos para as práticas museais. A Declaração de Quebec, de 1984, que sistematizou os princípios da nova museologia, e a Declaração de Caracas, de 1992, que reafirmou o museu como canal de comunicação. Todos estes documentos, conjuntamente com as produções teóricas de inúmeros investigadores latino-americanos da museologia, apuntam a uma série de questões e desafios, como a função educativa do museu e suas relações com o processo de educação formal, a importância da participação comunitária em las instâncias museais, a natureza específica do objeto museal como fenômeno de comunicação, e a pluralidade de museologias possíveis para o enfrentamento da complexidade sociocultural de nossos países, com a decorrente consolidação da museologia social e novos modelos de gestão e organização institucionais. A partir dessas perspectivas, evocaria, a título de exemplo, algumas iniciativas que ocorreram em Brasil nesse período e que me parecem ilustrar a vitalidade, diversidade e complexidade dos processos museológicos ocorridos e que se estendem hasta nossos dias. Em el campo de los museus de arte, o início das atividades do Museu Lazar Segall em São Paulo, em 1973, e a abertura do Museu de Arte Contemporâneo de Niterói, em 1996, a indicar novas visões de los processos de preservação do patrimônio artístico a partir de propostas de espaços de experimentação e criação. A criação por la etnia ticuna, em 1990, do primeiro museu indígena em Brasil, o Museu Maguta, na cidade de Benjamin Constant, em estado de Amazonas. A criação, em 1995, do Ecomuseu Cultural do Matadouro de Santa Cruz, dos primeiros museus comunitários de nosso país. A criação dos museus de imagem de sonido de Rio de Janeiro, em 65, e de São Paulo, em 70, apontaram na visão do reconhecimento da importância e da necessidade de preservação de suportes tecnológicos que então se consolidavam. A criação do Museu de História Natural e Jardim Botânico da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, em Belo Horizonte, em 65, a sinalizar uma nova etapa dos museus científicos e universitários, que tiveram outros momentos de destaque com a criação do Museu de Arqueologia e Etnologia da Universidade de São Paulo, em 89, e do Museu de Ciência e Tecnologia da Universidade Católica de Rio Grande do Sul, em Porto Alegre, em 98. Indiquei solamente algumas novas iniciativas que ocorreram em el período, e que vieram ampliar o universo das instituições museológicas brasileiras. Pero me gostaria aún registrar a continuidade e o perfeccionamento das atividades de todas as instituições anteriormente existentes e dois outros pontos muito relevantes. O primeiro foi a ampliação, em mesmo período, das escolas de formação de museologia. O Brasil contava já desde a década de 1930 com a Escola de Museologia da Universidade Federal de Rio de Janeiro e passou a contar, a partir de 1970, com o curso de grado em Museologia da Universidade Federal de Bahia, em Salvador, e a partir de 78, com o curso de especialização em Museologia da Escola de Sociologia Política de São Paulo. Esta consolidação do processo de formação profissional tendrá profundos impactos no desenvolvimento dos museus e da museologia em Brasil hasta nossos dias. O segundo ponto muito importante foi o crescimento e a valorização das atividades educativas em el processo museológico brasileiro, uma evidência clara de dos grandes retos de nossos museus hasta hoje. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, Marcelo. Rob?
Thank you, Américo, and thanks to all of you for having us here. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here. First of all, I wanted to recognize that on this panel, I'm bringing to you a very different kind of perspective to the question than others might provide. Museums were not my first career, and while I've researched and studied the theory of museums, much of what I've learned is from many of you in the room. And in distilling and trying to answer Américo's questions, I actually have found it hard to come to a concise answer, which I suspect is what Américo actually intended. Anyways, my views are anchored in a US practice of museums, and that being said, I wanted to react and challenge some of the assumptions in the question regarding the glorious decade of US museums from the 70s to the 90s. Perhaps determining what gloriousness for a museum looks like depends on an implied value system for which I feel a bit at conflict with respect to my own museum ideals and the questions focus on social impact. So I went to look for social impact in our histories in the US during that time. Certainly those decades saw many new museums built in the US and large and, quote, glorious expansions to include new wings, spaces for parties, the amassing of ever larger collections, and an explosion in the contemporary art market in the US. But I feel in hindsight that many of those so-called advances have had a cost to them that we're only really now starting to recognize and understand, and in some cases have distracted us from the true social impact that museums could have in our communities. In contrasting the development of museums during that time between Latin America and the United States, certainly sources of funding and where the money comes from exert powerful forces to drive cultural development according to certain particular agendas. Whereas museums in Latin America and Europe may be more heavily tied to funding through the state government and the policies and agendas that implies, museums in the US are more often tied to individual wealth of patrons and donors, and from that perspective, much of the best of that kind of philanthropy has given a legacy of open and generous culture that endows deep and rich collections and cultural experiences. But in the worst cases, vanity projects have been approved and built only later to threaten the health and vitality of museums and the communities that they're supposed to help. So if we turn the clock back to the mid-1980s, we'll find ourselves in the US in the middle of culture wars that really pitted a conservative agenda and ideology against an alternative worldview that valued artistic expression, free speech, and the acceptance and the value of all people. During that fight, museums were accused of serving only the cultural elites in the US and in broadly metropolitan areas, not being broadly representative of quote-unquote American community values. While that critique stings a little bit, it does, if I'm honest, bear some element of truth. And we still see its after effects today, and especially as we look for museums that are centered on the good of their audiences and local communities. Recently, just a few days ago, a report called Culture Track 2017 was released that cites that the #1 barrier for cultural participation in the US remains that, quote, "it's not for me." So our communities, even though they're very engaged, many of which stay away because they don't feel that the museum is for them. However, museums have come a long way in the US, and many of you in the room have been responsible for some of that change. In 1984, the American Alliance of Museums Commission on Museums for a New Century issued a call to increase the basic research around the role of learning in museums and to ensure that education was appropriately integrated into all museum activities. But reading that report some 30 years after its release, many of those topics would seem very familiar to you and things that we're still working on. But in looking again for that proof of social impact, I didn't find it. In hindsight, the report seems sterile and distant from what we think of as the core focus of museums today, anchored in the good of our communities. So it's not to say that the work of social impact was not happening in the field inside the US in the 1980s, but rather that it hadn't risen to the level of importance to be included in the report envisioning the role of museums in a new century. So moving forward, it's clear that reviewing these and other documents, what was happening is groundwork was being laid for an improvement and a recognition of the role of the audience in the visitor-centric model of museums that's more common to how we see museum service today. In 1992, the American Alliance of Museums issued a report called Excellence and Equity, which just celebrated its 25-year anniversary of being released. That report, among other things, set forth a much more inclusive vision for how museums must embrace cultural diversity in all aspects of their staff, audiences, and programming. Again, a precursor evidencing the change in thinking, but not yet an explicit mention of the role museums might play in social impact. Today, our organizations are focused much more clearly on the role museums play to bring real change into our communities. I feel lucky to be here in Medellin, as I feel that it's a great example of social impact that culture, museums, libraries, and others can bring to a city. And our current strategic plan is focused heavily on the ways in which we might advance diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. But certainly we have a long way to go. I think I spoke with Américo about this morning, but I would like to recognize that even amongst ourselves on this panel, we are not featuring the voices of women among this stage. And so I want to apologize for that. And you are valued voices, and I'm pleased and pleasured to work for strong women in Laura Lott and others on our board who are leading us capably and bringing really important points of view to the conversation. So, thank you.
Could I echo that point about women? And I would just like to say that my great inspiration in my career was a director at the Victoria and Albert Museum, Elizabeth Estev Cole, who was the first true radical who I met working in museums and has never been recognized for who she truly is. And whenever I have an opportunity, and I think the fact that there isn't a woman on the panel should be just such a one, I want to say that she has influenced a whole generation of those who wish to be influenced, which of course is not everybody. My career probably spans the period that Américo is describing here, which is a slightly frightening thought. I believe that this was an era in the Northern Hemisphere of complacency. Yes, new buildings were built. Yes, collections were better cared for. And yes, new public facilities were established. But I don't feel that there was a fundamental philosophical challenge to the model that we had during the beginning of that period. And even now, it still feels like the era of accommodation rather than the era of change in many institutions. I also want to sort of try to bring some complexity to the analysis on this. In the United Kingdom, which is the only sort of area I can really speak with strong experience, even within the United Kingdom, there were areas where that general model of glorious decades really did not apply. One of those was Northern Ireland, where I was born. And the conflict in Northern Ireland raged in the 1970s, the 1980s, and into the 1990s. And it largely crushed public cultural activity in Northern Ireland. And again, I want to give an example of a project, really, that I'm almost certain not even those in the United Kingdom will have ever come across. In 1798, there was a rebellion in Ireland against the British. And it was a rebellion of both Protestants and Catholics. And one of the great centres of the rebellion was close to Belfast in County Down. 200 years later, the Down County Museum did an exhibition about the 1798 rebellion. By that time, to be Protestant is almost certainly to be Unionist, in favour of the British model, if you like. And the fact that there was a history of many Protestants, including my own ancestors who lived there, rebelling against the British for human rights and for many other causes, was something that was deeply embarrassing to many in the Protestant community in Down County Museum. Nevertheless, the director put on an exhibition and organised tours of battle sites and other examples of exactly that Protestant dissent. And that, for me, was an extraordinarily brave thing for him to do. He wasn't in his job a year later. I don't know why that was the case, but he wasn't in his job a year later. And I doubt if anybody outside the local area even noticed what he'd done. But nevertheless, for me, that was an example of courage under very difficult circumstances in Ireland. So that the United Kingdom was in denial about its colonial past, and Ireland is an important part of that. And even today, there is no major museum in the United Kingdom outside Ireland that deals with the relationship between Britain, if you call it that, and Ireland. So this still feels like the age of accommodation rather than the age of change, really. Another dimension of change has been referred to, which is education and the growth of programs, particularly of working with audiences. And this has been really important. I think what it's led to, in some ways, is divided museums, and particularly the very large museums, which continue to be ocean liners which sail through time, much as they've always done. But down below deck, there is work going on that's different. And that's what it felt like to me as an educator during that period, that we were able to do projects that, in a sense, nobody in much of the rest of the organization cared about, but we cared about. And we were looking for a different model, a different philosophy for ourselves. And that also, I think, is a legacy of that era, because since then, what went on below the deck has been trying to push through and be visible and more influential above deck as well, but only to a limited degree. And if I look at the majority of the London National Museums particularly, it's a struggle. It really is a struggle there to bring the change of philosophy and the change of work. So don't be deceived by examples of projects. What matters is the whole organization, not just the project, not just the glossy corporate brochure at the end of the year. And that's where we've still got so much work to do, certainly in the United Kingdom. And then the third thing I want to take as a kind of counter strand, really, to the glorious decades, is that this was the era in Britain in which Margaret Thatcher destroyed most of the industrial base of the country, the mines, the steelworks, and much else as well that depended on it, and left poverty in communities at extraordinary levels, which still continues. Wales, where I work now, has got some of the poorest communities, not just in Britain, but in the whole of Europe as well, certainly Western Europe. And that legacy has carried across decade by decade by decade. And nothing much has changed that for those communities. It's something that certainly in Wales we're not yet adequately working to resolve. So I would summarize Britain as a country which is in denial about its colonial past, in denial about its empire, which has still got models which are shameful, really, of relationship with audiences, and which has got a lot of work to do if we're going to earn the right, actually, to be on the international platform with some very brave and very wonderful museums in Latin America, Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world.
Bueno, hemos escuchado tres... Ay, perdón, estoy dando media espalda para allá. Hemos escuchado tres presentaciones de tres lugares del mundo. En el caso de Marcelo, donde indudablemente, como dije yo en la presentación, Brasil ha sido uno de los ejemplos líderes de la modernización de la museología en América Latina. A la vez, creo entender que por su presentación nos está diciendo que la conflictividad política no incidió en ese desarrollo. ¿Es así? Porque no noté en tu presentación nada que dijera que la conflictividad política afectara ese maravilloso desarrollo de nuevos museos, nuevos estudios, nuevo pensamiento.
No, lo que intenté decir es que, a pesar de la violencia política, de todos los problemas, creo que fueron años de mucha lucha, mucha resistencia y que los museos lograron muchas conquistas. Creo que no podemos aceptar que por cuenta de una situación política se fue un desastre para los museos. No fue. Fueron momentos de mucha importancia. Logramos mucho, a pesar de la situación política, de todo lo que se pasó en todo, al menos en Brasil y creo para muchos de los países de América Latina.
You're open to make questions if you want. En el caso de Rob, hay algo notable con la asociación, la Alianza Americana de Museos, el hecho de que produce investigaciones sobre el estado del arte en las cuestiones sociales referidas a los museos. Estos trabajos que mencionó hablan del interés de la Alianza por examinar lo que está pasando en el radar de los museos, lo cual me parece de una utilidad fenomenal y muy poco divulgada, incluso los análisis que hacen hacia el futuro, los análisis que hacen del futuro de los museos. Vamos a la segunda pregunta, vamos a hablar más sobre ese tema, pero a la vez, en el caso de David, creo que es un ejemplo, una rara avis dentro del mundo más formal de los museos nacionales del mundo, que tienden a ser bastante ortodoxos y conservadores. Él tiene una mirada social muy importante y de hecho está en el comité para hacer la siguiente reunión de museos de Gran Bretaña en Irlanda del Norte, cosa que a la vez es tremendamente complejo dentro de un mundo bastante más conservador. Yo, salvo que ustedes tengan alguna pregunta entre sí, pasaría a la segunda pregunta. If you don't have another question, entonces pasamos a la segunda pregunta. La segunda pregunta es, estamos testimoniando una nueva ola de chauvinismo, aislacionismo y amenazas de extrema derecha que ponen en cuestión la diversidad. Las posiciones están divididas. Unos piensan que los museos no debieran reaccionar críticamente y otros urgen a los museos para que tomen una firme posición moral y se pronuncien de inmediato, como dicen hacerlo los periódicos con sus editoriales. La pregunta es, ¿pueden los museos contribuir institucionalmente a la discusión de un modo en que otros, como los medios de comunicación, no pueden?
¿Empiezo? Bueno, Yo veo a los museos como espacios de reflexión, cuestionamientos y preguntas, como espacios que estimulan el pensamiento y la creatividad, espacios de diálogos que proporcionan experiencias marcantes, memorables y constructivas. Los museos deben ser instituciones que se relacionen con la sociedad y el mundo contemporáneo, pero sin perder de vista sus especificidades y sus papeles. Necessitam, por lo tanto, identificar quais estratégias pertinentes e eficientes podem desenvolver sem cair em la tentação de um ativismo inócuo e arriesgado ou de um alejamento isolacionista igualmente negativo. Os museus possuem inúmeros instrumentos e modos de ação, como exposições, debates, publicações, espaços em los medios virtuais e outros. É necessário que evaluemos com cuidado quais são os mais adequados para cada situação, assim como que busquemos articulações com outros agentes sociais em enfrentamento de questões polêmicas ou socialmente delicadas. Em lo último mês, inúmeros museus e centros culturais brasileiros sofreram ataques de setores muito conservadores da sociedade, especialmente de fundamentalismo religioso, com sinais de grande intolerância. É necessário, para resistir a esses ataques, que devemos nos pensar como espaços de promoção da cidadania e da construção de uma cultura de paz.
So thank you, Marcelo. I also see museums as visitor-centered spaces, but I think they must be dedicated primarily to the public good. Recently, the topic of museums and their perceived neutrality, or lack thereof, has received a lot of attention. And in the midst of that debate, many have correctly pointed out that when faced with issues that demand a response, the lack of response is still a choice. To remain neutral is a choice. There's even a great T-shirt that many of you have seen recently, created by Mike Morosky and Latanya Autry, that says museums are not neutral. So on the flip side are those who rightly seek to enhance and preserve the trusted status of museums with the public as a reliable source of information. Personally, I believe that those two objectives are not mutually exclusive, and that the road to balance between them is oftentimes wider than we might think it is. In 1999, some almost 20 years ago, Americans for the Arts released a report called Animating Democracy, which talked about the capacity for the arts to become an active platform for civic dialogue. Reading that report again 20 years later, much of it feels very familiar to our circumstances today. They said, quote, "Yet there is a growing concern that opportunities for civic dialogue have diminished in recent years. Polarization of opinion along ideological, racial, gender, and class lines, exclusive social structures that separate rich from poor and majorities from minorities, a sense of individual disempowerment, and the overwhelming nature of many of society's problems are all factors contributing to this sense. Perhaps most fundamentally, the cross-cutting nature of today's complex issues often places them outside of traditional structures and settings, such as civic organizations, labor unions, and political parties, which have served in the past to organize civic discourse." I think that there's a huge opportunity for museums to step more fully into this role as a platform for dialogue and debate, and it's never been stronger than right now. Our ability to do so does not preclude us from also, at the same time, taking strong stances on the importance of our communities and our mission. Clearly, any issues that jeopardizes the museum's position in its community as an advocate for inclusive discourse should demand a response. This would include, in my opinion, any form of racism, oppression, or other exclusionary practices that make members of our broadest publics feel unwelcome. First, to do so, we must address the hard truths that there exists today language, practices, and circumstances in our museums that do cause communities to feel excluded, both in fact and in practice. Furthermore, I think that museums have an opportunity to engage proactively in historical events as they unfold, not only in the past tense. Many museums are already pursuing this, and many are taking opportunities to engage their communities in discussing how to document, process, and heal during those traumatic events. In the United States, this has happened specifically in response to the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. This summer, there were riots in Charlottesville, Virginia, against white nationalists who were protesting the removal of Confederate military statues. And also over the summer, the National Museum of African American History and Culture had a circumstance where a hangman's noose was left in the galleries and in other places in and around the National Mall. So more and more often, the public and the press are recognizing the part that museums can play in the contextualizing of these events. Philip Kennicott is the art and architecture critic for the Washington Post, and he wrote about this issue where the hangman's noose was left in the galleries. We have a number of colleagues from that museum, the National Museum of African American History and Culture here. I think I'd like to ask them more about this. But in his article, Kennicott debates whether the Smithsonian might consider accessioning this object into the collection and what impacts that might hold. So I pulled just a brief quote from him. He says, "One has to acknowledge the historical power of the object, a reference to lynching and by extension the use of racial terror to dehumanize and control African Americans, while also affirming the larger and redemptive power of the institution it was intended to vandalize. In a sense, it requires ordinary people to think like museum curators, to search out the meaning and history of an object while placing it in its proper context. The power of museums to do this, to neutralize without minimizing or denying a legacy of pain, is beyond extraordinary, especially in today's new economy of visual inundation and social media environments that reward both the giving and taking of offense. A thoughtful museum that confronts history honestly is like the control rod inserted into a nuclear reaction, absorbing and nullifying rampant energies." In closing, I do not think that museums play the same role as media outlets do, but I think that we can engage with current events as they connect to our communities in a discussion that's based on our shared history and cultures. Furthermore, I think that museums could take a stand on their own with respect to issues without shutting down respectful dialogue, and perhaps that could be a model for society as a whole.
Perhaps to echo what's already been said, one of the huge values of museums is their symbolic significance, which is very often out of all scale to the budgets they get and the size of the buildings and the organizations. And sometimes we find that to our benefit, and sometimes we find that to our cost as well. But I think it is an asset, and it's one that we see time and again that perhaps we're not using as fully as we could do. I mentioned the United Kingdom as a nation which has failed to come to terms with its imperial past. I should perhaps give a couple of examples where that's not true. One of them is where, in Liverpool, where the Slavery Museum, I think, broke incredible new ground by creating a major centre for debate around this particular element of empire in Britain. And I also want to mention that just in the last week or two, Birmingham Museum has opened an exhibition called The Past is Now, Birmingham and the British Empire, in which they say, whilst the empire has officially ended, its legacy still exists today in institutional structures and affects both individual and national senses of identity. And that's a major exhibition for Britain to have done. Maybe in other countries this could be taken for granted, but that's a major thing to have been achieved. To conclude, I just want to reflect really. Are museums places in communities, or even more fundamentally, are they a way of thinking? And I feel in some ways that as the diversity of our work ripples and spreads, and the locations which we operate in become more and more varied and richer because of that, that it may be time for us to step back and say, is there a distinctive way of thinking, a distinctive way of feeling, and a distinctive way of acting, which we could describe as belonging to museums? Or are those things, in fact, not exclusive or particular to us, but characteristics that are found in many places in society? And I feel that that question of locus, which can be so valuable and symbolic, and at the same time, ways of thinking, and possibly the tension between them is an area we're going to need to explore more as we search for new roles for museums.
Gracias a los tres, sin duda. Ha sido puesto en cuestión y ha tenido una divulgación mundial. Las primeras reacciones al gobierno de Trump, sobre todo en contra del National Endowment, de los fondos del National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities en los Estados Unidos, y algunas acciones de artistas, como sucedió en el Museo Whitney, o lo que mencionó Rob del African Museum of Arts and Culture. Es un tema que todavía, creo yo, que merece más discusión, en qué medida lo que uno piensa individualmente debe estar reflejado institucionalmente. Este es parte del problema. ¿Y quiénes son los que deciden cuál es la voz predominante del museo? Una de las sesiones que tendremos a lo largo de las tardes de los días que subsiguen es eso, descubrir cuáles son las voces que conforman la opinión institucional de un museo. Lo cual me lleva a la pregunta tercera y última. Retratar a los museos como colecciones de cultura universal, de valor incuestionable, progreso y descubrimiento de patrimonio nacional, es interpretado por algunos, y esta es una cita de James Clifford, como una respuesta burguesa del siglo XIX al cambio industrial y a la amenaza social. Si se piensa las colecciones como procesos históricos inconclusos de comunicación y conflicto entre comunidades discrepantes, ¿qué significa trabajar en medio de esta maraña en vez de esforzarse por trascenderlos? Sin duda, esta pregunta tiene mucho de provocación y esto es lo que he tratado de hacer para que nuestros huéspedes de hoy puedan agudizar su respuesta. Marcelo.
Para mí, uno de los más grandes equívocos que los museos pueden cometer es presentarse como construcciones concluidas, negando o escondiendo sus propias historicidades. Es fundamental que los museos se presenten y trabajen con la perspectiva de proceso, buscando identificar as vozes responsáveis por suas formações e também aquelas vozes ausentes, para criar um diálogo entre elas que pueda ser compreendido e ampliado por el público. Museus são espaços de estudo, investigação, educação, contemplação, ócio, diálogo e também de construção de histórias e narrativas museográficas. Al articular memórias, essas instituições produzem discursos expográficos que articulam variados linguagens e são apropriados por el público de diferentes formas. A forma mais usual de transmitir a memória é por narrações, que são elaboradas por meio de um processo dialéctico entre olvido e recuerdo, em el que el olvidar tiene um papel fundamental a dar relieve a lo que é recordado. As narrativas se constroem tanto de silêncios como de sonidos, como ocorre com a música, que se apresenta como uma sequência ordenada de notas sonoras e pequenas pausas silenciosas. Assim como seria inaudível uma peça musical que contuviera todas as possibilidades sonoras existentes, seria ilegível uma narrativa que contuviera todas as histórias do mundo. As narrativas, as histórias e também os discursos museológicos são construções sociais. Narrar o passado é reinventá-lo, é colocá-lo bajo el filtro interpretativo de seu narrador e ser um livro, um periódico, uma persona, uma exposição, uma instituição. ¿Cómo pensar entonces las historias contadas por los museos? Las narrativas museográficas se producen a partir de elecciones, disputas de poder e silêncios. Em elas estão contenidos os usos de determinados passados, materializados em los objetos do acervo e circunstanciados por los interesses del presente e de aqueles que los narram. Esta seleção produz ausências e olvidos. É o que chamamos el não dicho, típico de operações que se configuram nas escrituras de histórias. Por tempos, foi recorrente em los museus a seleção e a custódia de objetos representativos de las memórias de las classes dominantes, ocasionando olvidos e uma laguna em el acervo de peças que expressam os hechos de aqueles que a escritura oficial da história e a narrativa tradicional de los museus optaram por silenciar. Como exemplo, podemos citar a recorrente decisão de exponer peças representativas de la riqueza e del buen gusto, em detrimento de objetos utilizados por las classes populares, incluso quando ambos estão vinculados ao tema da instituição. Assim, o museu, que é um espaço de legitimação e valorização sociocultural, seleciona e discrimina ao mesmo tempo, produz vozes e silêncios e define o que será posto à vista. Sin embargo, al abrir-se ao diálogo com grupos sociais ausentes das narrativas museológicas tradicionais, as instituições começam a repensar o que foi imposto como verdade única. Com ele, os prejuízos são confrontados e outras possibilidades de narrativas são levantadas.
Thank you. Was really glad to have this question, Américo, and I think one of the things that I love about museums is that the nature of collections and their intended meaning versus their actual meaning can be quite different. So that is endlessly fascinating to me. I feel it's one of the reasons why the prospects for museum relevance going forward into future generations are quite good. And I want to take a bit of a different approach and encourage us to embrace that complexity more fully. So to reach these promises will require us to come to grips with the fact that collections have multivalent realities that are present, but today's culture tends to be uncomfortable with paradox, yet paradox surrounds us and in many ways defines aspects of the world that we live inside of. Too often, museum experiences are like pulling on one single thread. We notice its colors, its texture, it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. A charming introduction, a rousing climax, a convenient denouement, only to ignore the fact that the thread was part of a much larger tapestry whose story remains untold. Perhaps that word picture is even a little bit too tidy, because in the real world, histories are messy and contested. Objects can tell many stories, good and bad in the same package, and people themselves are a mess, often embodying contradiction in their words and actions. Elaine Gurian is here with us this week and has recently written a paper on the importance of and she encourages us to embrace the complexity and adapt our interpretive and storytelling models to allow our audiences to navigate this space. So in her paper, she says, museums, I am urging, need to help our citizens expect that real public problems are complex, that solutions are always approximate, and that unintended consequences can and do arise when least expected. We all need admiration for patience. We need new methods of discourse that includes a respect for people who see other parts of the problem in starker terms than we do, because what they are seeing is also partially valid. If most of our exhibitions remain the synthesis of complicated subject matter formed into one single narrative, then what will be omitted is a presentation of conflicting partial truths, and our audiences will not be challenged to reach their own nuanced understandings. As someone from a background in technology, I'm intrigued by the kinds of storytelling that we see in today's massively open world and multiplayer games. Rather than a simple story arc, these games allow players to explore worlds that are rich, dynamic, compelling, A player is free to define for themselves the path that they want to take through the story, to interact with other players or not, to engage with the world directly or merely observe. Might technology like this afford the design of in-gallery experiences for museums that could support this same kind of simultaneous open exploration, where the end goals of an exhibit are not obsessively predefined, but rather co-curated and co-created through the connection of audiences and objects together? Unique advantages might arise from this technique in that subsequent visits could yield brand new experiences to the same exhibition. Again, the Culture Track 2017 study that I cited earlier found that among frequent attendees to cultural experiences, an overwhelming 94% of them are likely to stop attending if those experiences are seen as unchanging. So I imagine that these co-created experiences would take on the texture and dynamic of the place where they're held and the community that they're a part of, such that the same objects displayed in different communities would become contextualized in completely different ways. Finally, I feel that we should own up publicly to the ways in which museums themselves impact and change the understanding of culture and our collections. The origin stories of those collections are fraught with the good, bad, and the ugly parts of our own histories. Stories about theft, imperialism, and ill-gotten gains coexist in these collections with the more philanthropic and altruistic mythologies that we tell about our own museums. Facing up to these origins might require hard action on the part of museums that preserve our position as a trusted partner and a platform with the public. But if we don't address those realities, that same position and our hard-won relevance is a fleeting proposition. Thank you.
In 2010, when I went to National Museum Wales, I spoke no Welsh. Wales was invaded by medieval English roughly 700 years ago, and at that point it was an entirely Welsh-speaking country. It wasn't actually a nation as such. It was a land area which hadn't formed itself into a nation at that point. As we sit today in the 21st century, still about 25% of the population speak Welsh fluently or well enough to communicate in that language. And in itself, that's an extraordinary achievement of cultural resistance. And it seems to have been one that was undertaken quite deliberately, generation by generation, as a way of preserving not just language, but also, of course, as we know, cultural distinctiveness in all sorts of ways. And today, I still speak very little Welsh, which is something I have to acknowledge. And it's now something like 30 or 40 years since National Museum Wales had a director who was a fluent Welsh speaker. So it's probably long overdue that my successor should be Welsh and Welsh speaking. What I'm trying to say is that conflicts and tensions of interpretation of the past are right at the center of the museum in which I work. There are 7 museums that make up National Museum Wales. 3 of those are very predominantly Welsh-speaking, and 4 of them are very predominantly English-speaking. And there is a cultural divide within the organization. There's no point in pretending that that's not the case. And there is an ongoing debate about how the 2 languages, the 2 cultures, can coexist within one organization, and what policies we should have to, in particular, to ensure that the Welsh language isn't lost. The more that we work as one organization, that doesn't mean we work as one English language organization too, which is the great risk of all this. So, alongside this, there is a debate about what is the Welsh nation. It's now 20 years since the Welsh were allowed to create their own parliament, which now meets, and it has responsibility for culture. But our museum has only recently started to say, what does this mean for us as a museum? Are we the National Museum of History for Wales, Or are we the Museum of National History, if you see the distinction there? And we see so many risks of creating a museum of national history. We've decided not to be the National Museum of Welsh History. We've decided to be the National Museum of History as a discipline, and to draw upon the past and the present from outside Wales as well as within Wales in order to reframe our thinking about the past of the landmass that calls itself Wales there over time. And I would have to say that this is a journey which we're still very much at the beginning of, really. We haven't resolved the practical issues of many of these challenges, but it feels like it's a journey that we have to make. And I think we'll be looking to see how other countries who have multiple official languages, at least 2 official languages, like Wales, and also conflicted histories of occupation and continuing colonialism, how they deal with those histories in ways which are constructive and developmental too. And one more thing I want to add. When there is a very, very major issue in a nation or a museum, and in our case, language and culture between Welsh and English-speaking communities, there is a great risk that other issues of diversity fall to the background in the face of the energy that's put into trying to resolve the front focus challenge. And I think that I have to say that our own museum, we need to reflect on that and try to make sure that we are looking at multiple issues and not just the one big one that we know we have to tackle.
Muchas gracias. La duda que plantea David sobre el galés y el inglés, creo que en nuestra región puede ser multiplicado por miles. Digamos, sabemos todos que las múltiples lenguas que están en extinción en América Latina, que se extinguen día a día por falta de un apoyo mayor, y a la vez lo que esas lenguas representan como símbolo de culturas en disolución, es una alerta importantísima que creo que nuestros museos tienen que recoger en todos los casos. No sé si querés agregar algo, Marcelo, a lo dicho. Bueno, en ese caso, esta sesión de conversación, como va a haber mañana también otra de igual carácter, no son abiertas a la discusión por una razón de organización, no es porque no tengamos cosas para escuchar y hablar, pero hemos decidido que las sesiones de diálogo, que son la mayoría, tienen un lado B. Ustedes verán en su programa que hay un lado B. Esto quiere decir que habrá una mesa como esta donde se presentarán los debates y luego los participantes tendrán la oportunidad de conversar con los presentadores sobre sus casos personales. Queremos que todos tengamos la oportunidad de conversar sobre nuestra propia circunstancia y de esa manera que el diálogo sea más fluido y nos sintamos todos, como en los museos, no como visitantes pasivos, sino como participantes activos. Yo quiero agradecer a mis colegas por la generosidad de estar acá con nosotros, darnos sus ideas, responder a las provocaciones y darnos todos sus puntos de vista. Un aplauso para ellos.